Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am across the street from number 133 George Street. This building was called Bryanston Court. There's a Bryanston Square not far away. Bryanston's a town and indeed a school in southwestern England. Not quite sure why this place is named after it. But anyway, this building is important because this is where Mrs. Wallis Simpson lived, or I suppose I would have called her Mrs. Ernest Simpson if I was being very formal, because she was married to a Mr. Ernest Simpson. And famously, this woman, she went on to marry King Edward VIII, although by the time she'd married King Edward VIII, he had abdicated the throne and been granted the title the Duke of Windsor. So this woman became the Duchess of Windsor. So let's rewind a bit. Anyway, Wallis Warfield was born in Pennsylvania in 1896 to a family of mainly English descent. They'd been in America for, well, since before the Revolution. But she was known as Bessie Warfield rather than Wallis Warfield locally. Her family had been quite well-to-do. They moved to Baltimore, Maryland. Her father died when she was very young, and they were growing up in somewhat straitened circumstances because of that. She had a wealthy uncle who helped them out. But she was aware of growing up in reduced circumstances, that their social standing and their income didn't match. So she really wanted to change that. Anyway, when she was 19, she married a man considerably older than her, who was a sea captain, and she spent some time in China. She had no children with her first husband, and they divorced. I'm not quite sure if that's a factor why. So then she returned to the United States. And what was she to do? She'd never worked. She didn't have any third-level education. Very few women did in the 1920s. And because of her background, her accent, and so on, and frankly her colour, this being a time of colour discrimination, she knew she could have got a reasonably well-paid job in an upmarket shop selling dresses, jewellery, something like that. But anyway, she decided far better to get herself a wealthy husband. Well, she succeeded. She met a man called Ernest Simpson, who was about her age, who was also divorced, and she married him in short order. So Ernest Simpson was born in the United States to a British Jewish father and to an American mother. So Ernest Simpson, he grew up quite well off. He went to Harvard University, and obviously all third-level education was outside the reach of most people back then, particularly Harvard, and he wasn't a scholar. So he graduated just after the First World War had started, but he felt some loyalty to the United Kingdom, even though I think he'd never been here at that stage. And he came to the UK and he volunteered for the British Army. The United States was neutral at that moment, and he served in the Coldstream Guards, one of the most prestigious regiments in the British Army. So if you see soldiers stomping around in front of Buckingham Palace in scarlet tunics, they might be the Coldstream Guards. There are 5 infantry regiments that do that, one of which is the Coldstream Guards, taking their name from a river in the extreme north of England, near Scotland, Coldstream. But the regiment's always pronounced Coldstream, with the D dropped. So it goes back to about 1650, that regiment. Anyhow, so I went across to France, was fighting in the First World War, but emerged unscathed. So she married him in the 1920s, and they moved here to London. So he was doing quite well for himself, and she lived there. But their marriage broke down after a few years, and they had no children. So Edward VIII was born in 1894. Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David. As in, he was named after his grandfather, then one of his maternal great-grandfather and another maternal great-grandfather, as in Prince Albert, and the other one was the King of Denmark, and then the patron saints of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales in that order. So of his 7 forenames, he's known as David, the last of those within the family. So he was educated by private tutors and then at a Royal Naval College to be a naval officer, and he was not exempted from any of the onerous duties or the stern discipline on account of his princely status. So then his grandfather died in 1910, so Edward VIII's father, George V, became king. Edward VIII was then invested as Prince of Wales in a ceremony at Caernarvon Castle in Wales, and he was taught by David Lloyd George, a prominent politician, taught to utter a few words in the Welsh language. But Edward VIII could speak a bit of French, spoke German very well, but didn't speak other languages. So he was not a bookish sort. Anyway, the Edward VIII, he went to Magdalen College, Oxford, when he was 18, spent 2.5 years there, left without a degree, had no thought of doing so, and he wasn't remotely academic, just there to meet sort of other upper-class youths and acquire a little bit of polish. And then the First World War broke out, so he served in the Welsh Guards, but they never let him get near danger. And he said, I feel like such a swine having a soft, comfortable life. When people he identified with, people from noble families, they were suffering and they were getting killed. And he did have some sympathy for the working class as well. There's a bit of a class gap even now. But if you go back over 100 years, the gap between, say, royalty and ordinary people was just an enormously wide gulf. Really, royalism was at its height in this country. So people were incredibly deferential towards the royal family, and the newspapers would never print a word that would reflect discredit on the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Well, the British royal family changed its name to Windsor in 1917, owing to anti-German sentiment during the Great War. So, anyway, Edward VIII, he showed no inclination to get married, and he engaged in affairs with several married women, exclusively with married women, though he had had liaisons with ladies of the night when he was in Paris. Like his grandfather, Edward VII, he's very keen on France. Anyway, because if he's having an affair with a married woman, if she became pregnant, the baby would be assumed to be that of her husband. These men knew what was happening. He was going out with married women, sometimes a few years older than himself, whose marriages had effectively failed, but divorce was a real no-no back then. Divorce was social death. You would just be cast into the outer darkness if you got divorced, even if your spouse was compulsively unfaithful. So divorce was a very lengthy, expensive and embarrassing process. So it was unthinkable, thought to be the height of immorality, even if you were the innocent victim of adultery. The other thing about these married women is they had no illusions. They knew he was never going to marry them, and they weren't getting to divorce, didn't wish to, even if they effectively lived separate lives from their husbands. That was that. In 1933, he met Mrs. Simpson, and he had an affair with her. He also had another mistress at the same time. It took him about 3 years to decide that she was the one for him. It was not love at first sight. He eventually phased out his other mistress and became faithful to Mrs. Simpson. And Mrs. Simpson and her husband were finally thinking of getting divorced. So on the 20th of January 1936, King George V breathed his last at Sandringham in Norfolk. Lord Dawson of Penn, King George V's personal physician, issued a bulletin saying the King's life is drawing peacefully to a close. Lord Dawson wrote in his diary that he'd given the King a fatal dose of morphine, knowing it would kill him. That didn't come out till decades later. Now, it's obvious that George V was going to die very soon, but he didn't have to die that day, might have lasted a few more days. Anyway, so Edward VIII was proclaimed king, that was that. And Fleet Street, well, the establishment, they all knew all about this affair, but they weren't going to say anything about it. And the Prime Minister at the time was Stanley Baldwin, saying, well, he can keep her as a respectable whore, just see her twice a week in the afternoon. But he soon decided that he wanted to marry her, and there was consternation. There were other things. People suspected him of being pro-Nazi, and indeed undermining the government in other ways, saying that something must be done for the unemployed on a visit to Wales. But that should be uncontroversial. Something should be done for the unemployed. Everyone would agree with that. What should be done is another matter. And so some people said he's secretly passing on information to the Third Reich. The German ambassador to the court of St. James was Joachim Ribbentrop at the time, later the foreign minister of the Third Reich, and indeed he was hanged at Nuremberg in 1946. And so the rumour had it that Joachim Ribbentrop visited Mrs. Simpson here, that he was also enjoying her favours. I don't know if that's true. Anyway, it all came out the wash, because that summer 1936 they went on a cruise together in the Mediterranean, stopping off. They were photographed together, and the French press saw no reason to keep stum about this, and were saying the King of the United Kingdom is having an affair with this married woman, and what else? And then the American newspapers reported it as well. Some in the government said, can we deport the Simpsons? But then they remembered, of course, Mr. Simpson was British as well as American, so they couldn't kick him or his wife out. But it all got a bit too much for Mrs. Simpson, and in the middle of 1936 she'd even suggested to the King ending their relationship, but he said, no, I want you, and indeed I want to marry you. Well, how's that going to work? And she couldn't take the hassle. He bought her another house in Cumberland Terrace, which I might show you later, but she owned it in her own name, so the King's name didn't need to be associated with it. She even fled to France in the autumn when the media pressure was getting too great, because obviously British people went abroad, read the newspapers, brought them back, and the gossip was getting out. It was no longer just whispered about in establishment circles. They couldn't sit on a story of this scale. So the scandal broke. What they're going to do, he announced his intention to marry her, and many people said, no, you can't possibly do that. The Archbishop of Canterbury said you can't do that because, you know, you're head of the Church of England, you're supposed to set a moral example, supposed to provide leadership, and you know that the Christian position is that marriage is indissoluble, and we very much frown upon marriage, divorce, and if someone does get a divorce, then they can't get remarried in the Church of England. Other Protestant denominations would remarry them, Baptists, Presbyterians, and so forth. So Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. There were other issues. Which is her second divorce. Both her husbands were still living. If she got divorced and then her ex-husband died, that would be that. She'd be free to marry. There were other things like she was presumably incapable of bearing children. It might have been Edward VIII was unable to have them because he had mumps as a child. That may have rendered him infertile. Anyway, so the public heard all about this. They asked the Dominions what they thought. The Irish Free State, Canada, Newfoundland, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. And some of the Dominion government said yes, he can marry her, others said not. Winston Churchill was one of the few who's in the establishment said fine, he can marry her. So it said that really the upper class and middle class were against her, the working class were on her side. We don't know. That's largely conjecture. There were no opinion polls at the time. And there's certainly, by December 1936, people protesting in favour of his right to wed whoever he wants. So three options were considered. Could he marry her and just have her as queen? Or could he marry her and have a morganatic marriage, as in she wouldn't be queen, she'd be princess consort or something, and any children that she might bear would have no right of succession. Such a system or such a policy been tried in various other realms. Or should he just couldn't marry her if he's going to remain king. So he decided he wanted to marry her and he wouldn't accept her second-class status for her not being queen, so he announced his intention to abdicate. So the 10th of December, he signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Park, and that was that. And they went off to France, and when her divorce became absolute, they married that following May in France. I won't tell you the whole story of the rest of their life. So anyway, this was their love nest for a while in the mid-30s. And she lived on the second floor. In British, we count ground floor first, second. So I'm not sure where along the second floor she lived. It was a 3-bedroom apartment. It sold recently in 2015 for £5.35 million. So there we go in this 7-story building. Anyway, that's probably enough about Wallis Simpson right now.